a guy, Edward Bernays. Okay, Edward Bernays, who was the inventor of, he invented the term, coined the term public relations. Okay, and really invented to a great extent what we think of as modern advertising. Well, interestingly, Edward Bernays had been a propagandist in World War I. That had been his original thing. He did propaganda. And when the war ended, he got contacted by a bunch of companies who were like, hey, we've been overproducing like mad for the war. How do we sell this crap? Right? How do you get people to buy this crap? Right? We need people to buy it, because if they don't, the whole economy collapses. We need people to consume. So do you think you can use propaganda to get people to consume? They didn't want to call it propaganda, so they changed it to public relations, PR. But the other interesting thing about Bernays is that while he was struggling to figure this out, as it happens, Edward Bernays was the nephew of Sigmund Freud. Mm-hmm. And so he sent money to Freud in Vienna, because Freud was on hard times. It's like, here's some American money, Uncle Siggy. And Uncle Siggy in return said, thank you, and sent a complete set of his books. Edward Bernays cracks these open, starts reading through them, and says, oh my God, this is it. This is it. This is the key. You don't, in fact, sell people to things by making rational appeals. You sell things to people by appealing to unconscious factors that are emotionally driven and symbolic. So prior to Bernays, most advertisement took the form of rational appeal. Advertisements would either be straight up snake oil, right, lies, or they would say things like, buy Gold Bond foot powder because it keeps your feet the driest, right? After Bernays gets this idea that what you do is you just symbolically link things together in this way that manipulates unconscious structures through fear and lust, because he's reading Freud, right? So I highly recommend, actually, anybody that's interested in this, go read, rather go watch. There's a 4-hour documentary, Adam Curtis, called The Century of the Self, that outlines this stuff really well. And you can watch it for free on YouTube. It's terrific. Even if you watch the first hour, it'll outline this stuff. And it's shocking for most people. So, he does this famous thing where women didn't smoke at the time. It was considered dirty, right? Men smoked, women didn't smoke. Cigarette companies wanted to sell more cigarettes. So he came up with this idea. He went and consulted with a psychoanalyst and blah, blah, blah. And then he came up with this campaign. And so he sort of arranged to get the press at a parade at a certain time, when a parade was including a group of society debutantes, right? Feminist women. And so at a prearranged time, they all reached into their coats, and there's the press ready to get it on camera, right? Something's going to happen. And they all pull out cigarettes, which were considered unfeminine and dirty, and lit them up as, quote, torches of freedom. So he linked it, right, symbolically, torches of freedom. I mean, that's some dark genius, that is, right? That's sorcery. This idea of torches of freedom, that smoking is somehow an act of freedom and feminism. And the rate on smoking skyrockets after this. The two things get tied together. That is not a rational appeal. And that is the basis on which advertising proceeds thereafter, right? It proceeds in this PR mold. So necessarily, this is not operating on a rational actor. What that means is that the consumerist capital economy, which already is full of a bunch of illogical nonsense, right? The whole idea of an infinite growth economy just does not square with the natural realities of the planet, so far as I can tell. You can't have an infinite growth system exponentially in a finite system, period, right? And unfortunately, we seem to be hitting the wall on that problem, but we'll see how that goes. The point is, right, if we don't keep that system growing all the time, the whole thing implodes. If you stop buying shit, the whole thing implodes, right? You can't stop buying shit. And this is not shit that you need. It's mostly shit you don't need, that you are convinced to need to meet an emotional need that it will not meet. The products themselves are often garbage, right? It's like, buy more shoes, buy more bobbleheads, buy fragrances, buy vaginal washes, buy this, buy that. It preys on your anxieties and your desires, gets you to buy things. Because if you stop buying stuff, the economy implodes, right? We have to produce and we have to consume. So much so that, in the wake of 9/11, for instance, one of the first things George W. Bush, the president, did was go out and say, get into the mall, everybody. Because this sucker could go down, as he said. That was the financial crisis later. But the point is, right, the whole system is predicated on this idea of making these irrational symbolic appeals. It basically took the healing arts of psychotherapy and turned them into black magic. And to be honest, that stuff it was predicted. So there's a really interesting theorist named Ion Culianu. He was a sort of one of the primary students of Eliade. Really, really interesting guy. And he wrote a book called, unfortunately, he died tragically early. He was murdered in a toilet on a campus in the States, very possibly by the Romanian secret police. Interesting story. But this guy, Ion Culianu, wrote this really interesting book called Eros and Magic in the Renaissance. And the argument that he makes is that when you look at the sort of Renaissance reemergence of magic into the cultural sphere, you can look at a series of people, Marsilio Ficino, et cetera, leading up to Giordano Bruno, right? And in particular, when you look at what these guys are talking about, when they're talking about Eros and magic, okay, when they mean Eros, they don't just mean erotic in the sense that we use erotic casually, sex, right? What they mean is the production of desire, right? The production of desire. And the systems that they're talking about is about producing the manipulation of Eros with symbolism. And Culiano points out basically that Bruno makes this really interesting argument. Bruno, fascinating guy who deserves much, much more attention. Galileo sort of caved and got off the hook. They burned Bruno for, among other things, proposing that there was life on other planets. Oh, no. Interesting guy. I left an offering at his statue when I was in Italy last. So Bruno basically proposes that in the future, okay, rulers won't necessarily need to resort to the use of naked force to compel the cooperation of their populations. Instead, they'll use magic. And when he says that, what does he mean? What he means is that they'll use symbolic systems to produce eros in the population. He's talking about propaganda, okay? In that sense, and this is Culiano's, I think, fascinating and underexamined point, Culiano proposes that we all live in what he calls sorcerer states, which is to say that the sort of, the forces that are largely in control of the movement of society, politics and the economy, right, routinely are using these kinds of systems to manipulate people at large. It's the manufacture of consent, right? Propaganda and advertising in not necessarily a rational way. And if you look at politics, you can see just how damn irrational it's all become.